Good afternoon, everyone. Good night for people who is in the other side of the world. And now we are going to begin the last session of our seminar. The session will be a conference given by Dr. Jason Moore. And the title of his conference is Preachers to Empty Pews, Marx, Wallerstein, and the worldwide class struggle in the web of life. Professor Jason Moore is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he is professor of sociology and leads the World Ecology Research Collective. He's author or editor, most recently, of Capitalism in the Web of Life, Capitalocene or Anthropocene, and Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crisis of Capitalism. And another book with Raj Patel is A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. His books and essays on environmental history, capitalism, and social theory have been widely recognized, including the Alice Hamilton Prize of American Society for Environmental History, 2003, and the Distinguished Scholarship Award of the section of the Political Economy of World System, American Sociological Association, 2002 for articles, and 2015 for the book Web of Life, and the Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Change, 2011. He coordinates the World Ecology Research Network. And in Brazil, as long as I know, he has one book published, is this one, Jason Moore, editor, and Antropoceno ou Capitaloceno, Natureza, História e a Crise do Capitalismo. I'd like only to say that Jason Moore is a very innovative researcher, and he is, I think, the main researcher on linking ecology and world system analysis. And he has very, very innovative and questions and concepts, as you see. Everyone who is interested in the relation between capitalism, ecological crisis, must read Jason Moore. And I recommend in Portuguese for beginning this book. So Jason, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to have you with us.
It's a great honor. I am just sorry that I could not be there in person. Thank you for that kind and gracious invitation, and thanks to all the comrades for organizing what looks to be a fantastic meeting. Without further ado, we can now contemplate the question of the worldwide class struggle in the web of life. Emanuel Wallerstein published an important essay in 2001 entitled Brodel and Interscience, Preacher to Empty Pews. It is among his least cited essays. That's no accident. The argument did not sit well with folks in the tradition of Pews, the acronym for the ASA's section on the political economy of the world system. In Wallerstein's crosshairs was not simply the fragmentation of the so-called disciplines. It was the problem of the two cultures, to invoke Snow's famous distinction between what Brodel called the human sciences and the natural sciences. Interscience is Wallerstein's concept and Brodel's idea. The spirit of Brodel's argument was articulated most famously in 1958's Histoire et Sciences Sociales on the longue durée. Brodel's interscience, Wallerstein says, is the totality of what has been paraded under the labels of the social sciences. It is the whole of them, not in the form of some confederation of principalities, each of which is defending its domain against too much encroachment by the inclusive category, but as an interwoven cloth with countless threads. The idea that the single faculty in 19th century universities should be divided into the sciences and humanities is the result of the so-called divorce between science and philosophy, and the reification of modern science as a separate method, a different theory of knowledge than philosophy, the only route, according to the scientists, to achieve truth. Science, as they were now defining it, was more than merely another form of knowledge. It was the anti-philosophy. And when Wallerstein writes this, it is clearly the case that he is implicating more than merely forms of knowledge. Wallerstein might have added that this two cultures divide was fundamental to bourgeois ideology from the 17th century, a dynamic that I have abbreviated as good science in emphatically critical terms, closely bound to what Habermas in the late 60s terms the scientization of politics, very much the bellwether of our times. The relation between intellectual life, the knowledge factory, and imperialist policy was, of course, where Wallerstein cut his teeth. This began, as we know, with the critique of Cold War developmentalism, of its methodological nationalism in thought and practice, of the role of universities in American hegemony. The Marxist critique of science, power, and class hardly begins with Wallerstein. It begins with Marx in his earliest writings from the manuscripts, The German Ideology. The gist of the argument will be familiar. Long before Dietzgen and Lukács were writing of a proletarian standpoint in science, Marx had outlined the historical materialist position. Here he is in the manuscripts. Marx writes, natural science will in time incorporate itself into the science of man, just as the science of man will incorporate itself into natural science. There will be one science. The social reality of nature and the human natural science, or the natural science of man, are identical terms. There's a wrinkle to this formulation that is not well understood, but which is central to Marx's understanding. Man and nature are not adopted from bourgeois ideology premised on what Marx variously calls a one-sided or abstract humanism and naturalism. Long before Snow's two cultures came, Marx's critique of bourgeois humanism and naturalism. Many eco-socialists have ignored Marx's insistence on this human essence. This is clear in the manuscripts and even clearer in his theses on Feuerbach. The essence of man is no abstraction, he writes, it is the ensemble of the social relations. Later that same year in the German Ideology, Marx clarifies, all historical writing, that is, the historiography of class society, must set out from these natural bases and their modification in the course of history through the action of men. The production of life, both of one's own in labor and of fresh life in procreation, now appears as a twofold relation. On the one hand as natural, on the other as social. As if to underline the point Marx insists, these are not phases of development or separate realities. They are, quote, moments which exist simultaneously. This is key to Marx and Engels' labor theory of life, aptly abbreviated by Engels many years later. Labor created man. It was Brodel who opened Wallerstein's eyes to interscience and its logic of transcending the two cultures. Brodel's Mediterranean is, of course, a masterpiece of geohistorical writing, weaving together historical change with and within webs of life. It would license Wallerstein to do something distinctive in the modern world system, to explain the transition to capitalism through a socio-physical conjuncture of generalized class war. His words. It was a transition, moreover, influenced and inflected by the Little Ice Age, and that precipitated a commodity frontier strategy that would reshape, again, Wallerstein's words, world ecology in the interests of accumulation in the imperialist centers. But Wallerstein's ideas on class war in the socio-physical conjuncture have had few takers. As with Brodel and Marx, Wallerstein has been a preacher to empty pews. While Brodel's interscience was, to be sure, not a proletarian interscience. More on that in just a moment. Brodel, along with historians like Innes, Simonson, and Webb in the 1930s, was able to go where the main lines of Marxism could not. There were intrepid Marxists willing to engage the metabolic and class dimensions between capitalism, science, and what Marx often called the rest of nature. Marx's ontology of class struggle as a labor metabolic antagonism between modes of life and modes of production, the outlines of a labor theory of life, was there from the beginning. But the world left kept its distance from environmentalism, and for good reason. There were many reasons for this distancing, but one of them was not that Marxists didn't care about the web of life, or that socialist struggles were not finally attuned to the realities of pollution, health, and manifold forms of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. Let us consider the hegemonic sense of environmentalism for the century prior to 1970's Earth Day. In the world historical conjuncture between roughly 1880 and 1970, environmentalism meant something very different from its hegemonic conception today, and something very much darker. Environmentalism was a genus of ideology that employed good science to explain, justify, and reproduce capitalist inequality through natural law. This is the power of bourgeois naturalism. Malthus and classical Malthusianism is one very obvious species, but that was not isolated. Before Malthus, there was Locke, and after Malthus were Galton and Haeckel, Hardin and Ehrlich. This environmentalism was a heady brew of eugenics and scientific racism, anti-third world and anti-working class and communist politics. From the 1880s onwards, its pivot has been technocratic managerialism to, quote, save nature from the dangerous classes, from the savages, variously indigenous, immigrant, communist, and otherwise uncivilized. It's by no means limited to thinkers, of course, who were and are, as Marx might say, the personification of the means of mental production and the ruling ideas that issue from the knowledge factory's gates. The point, rather, is to underline what I've called a long Malthusian cycle, marked by the recrudescence of environmentalist thought and ideology at moments of widespread peasant, proletarian, and anti-colonial revolt. Any revolutionary Marxism worthy of the name was correct to steer clear of this environmentalism. The Malthusian moment of the post-World War II Golden Age was a thoroughly Cold War project. American imperialism constructed an unprecedented techno-scientific apparatus intimately connected to the war machine. Terence Seltzer has written a wonderful book on this. It's entitled How the United Nations Built Spaceship Earth. American hegemony depended upon a good science strategy, along with Agent Orange, countless regime change efforts, and endless war in the South to deal with an unprecedented problem. The crux of the matter was this: how to secure world hegemony without formal colonial empire. The answer had everything to do with the socialist challenge and national liberation movements. They threatened to pursue developmentalist strategies that might consume the cheap natures desperately needed by a United States, both for its own corporate profitability and also, crucially, for control over a vast trilateral zone anchored by Britain in the West and Japan in the East. In this conjuncture, good science became a pillar of American world hegemony. For architects of Pax Americana, Seltzer writes, the non-political reputation of science was a critical political resource. Science revealed the unity and diversity of nature that made the interdependence of nations inevitable. Because natural phenomena paid no heed to national boundaries, national progress depended on transnational corporation, of course, under the beneficent guidance of the United States. Science, therefore, ought to guide the integration of global society, the remaking of political geography to match nature's pattern of universal validity. Fundamental to this project, as we have just seen, was an imperialist interscience to which we can trace the lineages of today's Earth system science and its Anthropocene fetish. This should not surprise us. Since the end of the 19th century, geology and its geographical cognates had been closely, intimately tied to imperialism. After World War II, a fusion of cybernetics, planetary surveillance, and the biosphere sciences began to take shape. Let's call it the scientific Cold War. When a new Malthusian moment congealed after 1968, these elements were not displaced, but integrated at the high point of Third World Revolt, not a historic accident. But meanwhile, on the other side of the two cultures, we find a cultural Cold War. Francis Saunders and others have written elegantly on this matter, so I'll spotlight the key world historical point. As Saunders underlines, the mission of the cultural Cold War was to nudge the intelligentsia of Western Europe away from its lingering fascination with Marxism and communism and towards a view more accommodating of the American way. The cultural Cold War was everywhere, but its epicenter was France. Seeking to build a liberal anti-communist intelligentsia and academic programs with it, the American empire poured rivers of cash into French cultural and academic affairs. This was accomplished formally by, above all, the Rockefeller and Ford foundations, whose personnel and social connections with the American empire and with the Central Intelligence Agency were overlapping and quite intimate. Throughout the Cold War, the nexus of the Ford Foundation, the CIA, and the State Department was such that it's best to think of these units as related to each other in the way that Ford's truck division today is related to its electric vehicle department. So what does this have to do with Braudèl's interscience and the possibility or challenge today of a proletarian interscience? I'll try to explain. Braudèl's ascent to the commanding heights of French cultural life after World War II owed a lot to his unquestioned brilliance and to the largesse of the American empire delivered through the Rockefeller and Ford foundations. It was Rockefeller Doe that in 1948 allowed Lucien Febvre to establish the 6e section of the École pratique des hautes études, my apologies for my wretched French, which Braudèl would lead from 1956. In 1959, the Ford Foundation financed with $1 million grant the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. It was in these years that Braudèl would formulate his interscience. It followed Braudèl's study trip in the autumn of 1955 to leading American universities like Harvard to study area studies programs. This was done on the Ford Foundation's dime. He had discovered area studies, and this would lead Braudèl to write 1958's longue durée essay. This isn't the place to rehearse Braudèl's arguments, most of which will be familiar to this audience. Suffice it to say that what Braudèl says of Marx, frequently and repeatedly, applies even more readily to Braudèl. He introduces questions, especially of temporality and geography, that he cannot answer. These are useful, indeed indispensable questions. His narratives are, of course, flush with insights, and I've written at some length on these. But in no way should we permit ourselves to disregard the historical, political implications of Braudèl's interscience and its accommodation with area studies, a key academic node of Cold War power. Don't think that I exaggerate. In his day, Braudèl's academic empire was widely regarded in France as a Trojan horse of Americanization, probably the worst thing you could say about any cultural figure in that period. He was widely denounced as an enemy of the left, and I'm not sure that they were wrong. Braudèl's interscience shared with his area studies, a profound anti-communism, to the degree that Braudèl in his writing is softer on Marx and communism than his American counterparts. It was surely a concession to French political culture and the PCF's popularity. Area studies in its familiar form, we should note, crystallized through the Office of Strategic Services during World War II to study the Soviets. It was social science in one country, to borrow from Barry Katz's fine history on the topic. By 1947 and then 1949 with Truman's Point 4 speech, area studies became a fundamental node in what Senator Fulbright would later call the military-industrial academic complex. area studies was the academic node of American counterinsurgency. Within Marshall Plan Europe, the OSS morphed into the CIA, cultivating and financing networks of anti-communist liberal intellectuals and helping them build institutions. That's no footnote to the story. And the parallels to today's environmentalism of the rich and its thought are striking. But for now, let's simply acknowledge that the policy apparatus of developmentalism, of population control programs and green revolutions, of counterinsurgency and regime change worked hand in glove with the cultural Cold War universities, and America's effort to contain and profit upon a decolonized world. Wallerstein, as we all know, was a leading critic of area studies. He understood the organic relation between the Cold War university and American imperialism. The argument was bound to a critique of the disciplines in general, and especially around the turn of the last century, to a critique of the two cultures in particular. Wallerstein's conception was a roundabout way of addressing the dualism of nature and society, but its core premise finds expression in what I'm arguing today about good science and the ideological violence of imperial naturalism. Here is Wallerstein in 1997. He writes, "The idea that science is over here and socio-political decisions are over there is the core concept that sustains Eurocentrism. Any argument that reinforces this separation of the two cultures thus sustains Eurocentrism. If one denies the specificity of the modern world, one has no plausible way of arguing for the reconstruction of knowledge structures. To extend the argument, capitalist geoculture, this is me now, capitalist geoculture is premised on the alienation of knowledge that we call the two cultures, for the specific historical reason that the twin priorities of global conquest and planetary management called forth systems of thought premised on the naturalization of laboring classes and their effective management in specifically capitalist ways. Thus, the symmetry of civilizer and savage with manager and worker, thinking things and extended things. This is at the heart of the Cartesian Revolution, not as a philosophical event, but as a geocultural revolution pivotal to the strategies of managing labor, land, war, and life. The two cultures, as they emerged during capitalism's first great era of climate crisis in the long 17th century, were not only geocultural or epistemological phenomena, they were the managerial software, if you will, of capitalism in the web of life. From this standpoint, Wallerstein's breakthrough in the modern world system was a rupture with Marxism's social reductionism and with neo-Malthusian historiography's demographic determinism. The pre-war analyses were crucial in this rupture, and Brodel's Mediterranean crystallized that influence. For the pre-war analysts, history and geography were two moments of a singular historical process. Geography, therefore, loomed much larger in Brodel's interscience than it did for American area studies proper. 2 decades ago, I underlined the key elements of Wallerstein's eco-historical approach, which I summarized then as an argument for capitalism as a world ecology, and not, emphatically not, the environmental history of social processes. In this alternative, metabolic, climatic, and geological conditions and relations are active moments, producers and products of capitalist relations. So let's consider, much too briefly, the 3 main socio-ecological theses in Wallerstein's best known but rarely read work in relation to this argument. First, Wallerstein's perspective was not Brodelian but Marxist, where Brodel had set about cooperating with figures like Michael Poston, the great anti-Marxist medievalist. Wallerstein turned instead to Rodney Hilton, the vastly superior Marxist medievalist. Hilton was among those who identified feudalism's tendency towards soil exhaustion, but in contrast to Poston, he insisted that this was a class historical dynamic. Feudal civilization's logic of accumulation, seigneurial reproduction, and peasant-dominated cultivation undermined its metabolic conditions, Hilton argued, given the technical and property relations of the time. It was an implicit eco-historical reading of what Guy Bois would a few years later call the tendency towards the declining rate of feudal levy. Thus, we encounter Marx's labor metabolic method in narrative form, through which class societies variously produce and are produced by metabolic antagonisms whose history was imminent to the class struggle. Second, Wallerstein's class historical reading of Brodel led him to other bourgeois historians who took the web of life seriously. These included figures like Webb and Innes. They also included decisively the Swedish economic historian Gustaf Uderström. Uderström's landmark 1955 essay on the Little Ice Age clarified the profound impact of the shift away from the medieval warm period at the dawn of the 14th century. Wallerstein took that climate shift seriously. Along with Hilton's reading of feudalism's class metabolic antagonism, Uderström led Wallerstein to characterize the feudal crisis as a socio-physical conjuncture. Climate change suppressed agricultural productivity, and with it, the decisive material basis for feudal accumulation. This was part and parcel of a socio-physical conjuncture characterized by, in Wallerstein's words, generalized seigneur-peasant war with manifold expressions in peasant and urban revolts, ruinous wars between the states, endemic discontent within the seigneurial classes. In contrast to virtually every intervention in the transition debate then and now, Wallerstein understood that the climate shift was pivotal to feudal crisis. Obviously, he argued in 1974, to the extent that there was climatic change, it would affect the operations of a social system. Yet equally obvious, it would affect different systems differently. Social developments in Asia and North America were clearly divergent from those in Europe. It would be useful, therefore, to return to the chronic factor of resource strain involved in feudalism, or the overconsumption by a tiny minority, given the overall low level of productivity. If, however, there was first economic regression because of the chronic overexploitation and resulting rebellions discussed, then climatic figures added on to the cumulative woes of the mode of production. It is easy to see how climate could contribute to a conjuncture of crisis proportions. Now, third, these insights led Wallerstein to frame a narrative in which the imperialist and class historical character of reorganizing world ecology, his words, featured prominently. Wallerstein's world ecology was, of course, without the hyphen that I have favored. No matter, his explanation of the transition to capitalism grasped the imperialist refashioning of planetary ecology as, first, an imminent moment of capitalist class formation and accumulation strategies. Secondly, his interpretation joined dialectically the proletarianization of labor, the accumulation of capital, and commodity frontiers, all within the web of life. If the feudal crisis was a socio-physical conjuncture, so is the formation of a capitalist world economy, what I would call a capitalist world ecology, across the long 16th century. Wallerstein's geographical argument is frequently misunderstood, so it bears repeating in two steps. First, the climate class crisis of feudalism was a moment of historic defeat for Western Europe's ruling strata. It involved, as we've seen, ruinous warfare, but also the inability of Western Europe's seigneurial classes to reimpose feudalism. The only solution, Wallerstein writes, that would extract Western Europe from decimation and stagnation was one that would expand the economic pie to be shared. It required great frontiers of appropriation and commodification. This observation was only the first moment of explanation. The second turned on this point, the imperial refashioning of world ecology. The expansion of the economic pie, as Wallerstein says, and the expansion of the land area and population base to exploit was for Wallerstein a question of environmental history. World ecology, he writes, was altered, and in a way which, because of the social organization of an emergent European world economy, would primarily benefit Europe. So building on Marx and Brodel, Wallerstein saw this epical refashioning of world ecology as ongoing, the biogeographical accompaniment to capitalism's expansionism, itself a search for low-cost labor forces. That nexus of world ecology and world class formation under conditions of imperial rule would decisively inform my formulation of capitalism as world ecology in the early 2000s. Wallerstein's interpretation was precocious and prefigurative, taking seriously capitalism's tendency to degrade the worker and the soil, and therefore to exhaust its socio-ecological conditions of reproduction. Highlighting sugar, early capitalism's defining mass commodity, we learn from Wallerstein that sugar was, quote, very lucrative, but also devastating to soils and labor power. Exhausting the soil, in Wallerstein's words, required ever new lands, not to speak of the manpower exhausted by its cultivations. Connection of the soil and the worker, consciously or not, is fundamental to the historical materialist project. And Wallerstein opened an example of a narrative strategy that would knit these points together in a way that the main lines of eco-socialist thought and of world historical and world systems thought have generally refused to do. What Marx would say is that we need to build on the relation of the soil and the worker of, if you will, biotariat and proletariat, and link cycles of proletarianization with and within earthly cycles of biospheric reproduction, all in the emergent antagonisms of the endless accumulation of capital. So Wallerstein's critique of the so-called disciplines, a phrase he was using as early as 1971, was bound to this critique of the two cultures and to Cold War area studies. Much of what he imputes to Brodell's interscience was, at best, a projection of Wallerstein's interscience onto Brodell. Brodell was a brilliant paragon of Cold War liberalism with a French flair. His geographical imagination, inherited from Bloch and Febvre in the interwar period, was significant and opened Wallerstein's eyes to the possibility of forging a Marxist narrative of capitalism that took seriously the web of life. No small thing, this. Wallerstein, for his part, was seemingly largely unaware of what he had done until much later. Nevertheless, the eco-historical and geographical synthesis of class, empire, and the web of life stood as a provocative and tantalizing guide to future investigations. But here it was Wallerstein, not Brodell, who was the preacher to empty pews. Neither historical sociologists nor environmental historians were having it. The worldwide class struggle and the socio-physical conjuncture were never synthesized. Upon founding the Brodell Center in '76, Wallerstein's first seminar series was entitled The Historical Geography of the Modern World System. An apparently short-lived research working group was convened on ecologies of the modern world system, led by Neville Dyson Hudson. It went nowhere. There are undoubtedly idiosyncratic reasons for why the socio-ecological project, explicit in Wallerstein's Marx-Brodell synthesis, went nowhere. But from the wider conjuncture of the 70s era politics and knowledge, it's clear that the political and intellectual and institutional divides between post-New Left socialist politics and mainstream environmentalism were too much to overcome. American environmentalism was especially problematic in this era, evincing a technocratic and anti-democratic politics of law and science. Its intellectual superstars resembled Brodell's centrist liberalism on a good day, much more than Wallerstein's professorial but impassioned anti-imperialist Marxism. Let's also note that the dominant lines of environmentalism before and after 1970 were objectively right-wing. Ehrlich's and Cadden's brutal neo-Malthusianism, Hardin's eugenics, and mainstream environmentalism's anti-immigrant and anti-worker technocratic politics are just the tip of the iceberg. To put it crudely, for every socialist like Raymond Williams or Barry Commoner, there were 10 Ehrlichs. The new environmentalism was, moreover, one face of the cultural Cold War coming home, with the Fords and Rockefellers financing key sectors of second wave environmentalism after 1967, foremost among them the Environmental Defense Fund and the Natural Resources Defense Council. Meanwhile, in academia, elements of a world systems approach to environmental change materialized from the mid-1980s. And yes, there is a longer lineage that we can recuperate. it became increasingly clear that the new left Marxism's commitment to class analysis, which had always been shaky, had lost decisively. The key text here is Bunker's Underdeveloping the Amazon. Brimming with insights, it's a work defined theoretically and politically by its rejection of Marx and Marxism. In reality, Bunker's objection was mostly to Marxism's social reductionism, since he spends no time at all dealing with Marx's actual formulation. The important thing here is not to pick on Bunker's book, which was tremendously generative in so many ways, but to situate these moments within an overall movement in academia, the resulting procedure of what I have called green arithmetic, the adding up of social and environmental factors, of the so-called exploitation of labor and the environment abstracted from their constitutive inner relations. The fruits of green arithmetic are crystal clear in world systems environmental literature that emerged over the next few decades. Class dynamics, class exploitation, class formation, class struggles were progressively sidelined, marginalized, or even entirely excised, as with the unfortunate embrace of Heideggerian deep ecology. In line with the Cartesian revolution, in these studies, substances, nature, land, resources were abstracted, they were fetishized, they were prioritized over the relations of capital and class, rather than understanding elements of the web of life in their becoming. Resources become, as Zimmerman, the dean of resource economics, wrote in 1931. The outcome was a double whammy of substance and market fetishism, wholly consonant with the neoliberal turn. Hornborg's anti-Marxist screeds on ecologically unequal exchange are a good example. Bunker's trajectory was also instructive. Fully breaking with Marx by the end of the 90s, we were given a, quote, new historical materialism that coupled Harold Innis's staple theory, which itself combines substance and market fetishism, with Walt Rostow's leading sector approach. This was unfortunate. For those who don't know, Rostow was a ruling class intellectual, not only a Cold War methodological nationalist, that can be forgiven, but an architect of American imperial strategy in Vietnam. There's an undeniable truth that bad people can have good ideas. This probably is not one of them, and we can quibble about that and argue about that after the talk. Even when Marx's close to the world systems position intervened in these discussions, they could write of labor, but not of class struggle, not of class formation, not of capital accumulation. Don't take my word for it. Go read John Bellamy Foster's 1999 metabolic rift paper. Go read Clark and Foster's guano trade paper a decade later, and everything in between. In every case, the two cultures divide. The academic expression of a long-standing logic of the civilizing project was affirmed. A movement that could have brought out the best of world systems and environmentalist studies brought out instead the worst of both. I've said Wallerstein too became a preacher to empty pews, as he recognized late in life he had gone too far when he stopped speaking of the worldwide class struggle, of world class formation, and all the rest. After all, his conception of core periphery structure foregrounded class formation, flows of surplus value, and what he called, at least until 1983, the worldwide class struggle. You'll be forgiven if you never read this Wallerstein. Nobody reads it, and world system scholars rarely teach it. And of course, with all these points, there are valiant exceptions, counter tendencies, as Marx might say. But we are looking at the principal tendencies in these dynamics. So when Wallerstein wrote about the structures of knowledge, increasingly after 1983, he did so without foregrounding the historical nexus of intellectual, institutional, and ideological life in that worldwide class struggle. Wallerstein would surely have agreed that the two cultures in my geocultural reading were not simply epiphenomena of capitalism. They were fundamental to Marx's means of mental production, the software of empire, and the endless accumulation of capital that it enabled. So how do we bend the stick in the other direction, the proletarian direction? Well, I have good news and bad news. Reading Marx will not save us, but taking Marx seriously will, or will help us. For Marx is also a preacher to empty pews these days. Let me begin by saying what virtually all eco-socialists have forgotten. Historical materialism is historical, or it's nothing. And of course, from the beginning, Marx grasped the world historical character of specifically capitalist development. Our debates cannot be resolved on the terrain of theory, contrary to Foster, Malm, Saito, and the other high priests of eco-socialism. They must be resolved on the terrain of world history. For Marxism is not only historical materialism as world historical thought, but a philosophy of praxis, as Gramsci underlines. Praxis implicates two moments. One is the ongoing reevaluation of practice and theory in light of each other in the present moment. The second is praxis as retrodiction, as the interpretation of capitalism's specific patterns and turning points. Patterns and turning points of what? Well, of course, the class struggle. And I would say with Marx, the class struggle in the web of life as a labor metabolic antagonism. My geohistorical thesis on the origins of capitalism in today's planetary crisis, abbreviated as the Capitalocene, is well known. In this concluding part of my talk, the mode of presentation is conceptual, but the mode of dialectical construction is world historical. That means we can go back into the history and talk about why it matters. This retrodictive moment of praxis matters. Well, for all its variety, a Marxist critique of capitalism coheres through its commitment to a class struggle analysis. The analytic commitment is a political commitment to the transition to socialism. That's minimally defined as the epical extension of proletarian power and the subordination of capitalist forces over the reproduction of planetary life. Yes, indeed, there are many transitional phases that implicates. As with the question of capitalism, how we conceptualize labor, class, and the class struggle makes all the difference. For now, it's sufficient to emphasize that the Capitalocene thesis is a contribution to those theoretical historical tasks, what Lenin called the theoretical struggle, and therefore to a socialist praxis of revolutionary change. In that revolutionary struggle, a young Marx reminds us, the development of communist consciousness threatens to become a material force. His words. Why? Because for Marx, the human tendency towards solidarity and mutuality, long evident in primitive communism, can be activated through capitalism's geographical development and the ideological struggle. Communist ideas from Marx gestate within class society and not just capitalism. The dawn of capitalism activates this latent tendency. The greater the development of the productive forces and the world semi-proletariat, the more elaborated and influential communist ideas can become. The material basis for historical materialism, Marx and Engels tell us in this initial outline in the German ideology, is the development of the proletariat, which can only exist world historically, as they say. And we can look at the ways in which its irreducibly socio-ecological relations and relations of thought and body are themselves a potentially powerful source of the cooperation from which springs the communist imagination and the solidarities necessary to advance it. Against vulgar materialism, this Marxism insists that things are relational entities. Objects are relations, and processes externalize internal processes and internalize external processes. This is what I call the double internality. For any being or social process, as Marx says, inside and outside are dialectically joined. This is Marx from the manuscripts onward. Human relations, then, are relations with and within the web of life. Those are, as Marx underlines, relations of consciousness and therefore cooperation that are bound to bodily labor. It's this nexus of consciousness and cooperation that distinguishes the labor of humans from the work of other animals, even as human labor is dialectically interdependent with those extra-human flora and fauna, organic and inorganic life. It's the world ecology conversation that insists capitalism puts not only humans to work, but the totality of life within its grasp. as Marx speaks of the soil and the worker, we can insist on the differentiated unity of proletariat and biotariat. In this light, bodily labor is therefore both subject and object of wider webs of life. The human relation to nature, both in scare quotes, emerges through labor, as Engels underlines. Labor created man. In the history of capitalism, modern fetishes, the ruling abstractions of nature and humanity, were invented because of early capitalism's underproduction of labor power. This master binary, nature and man, was the ideological expression of class formation under conditions of primitive accumulation and its civilizing projects. As a result, the vast majority of humankind were redefined as part of nature, the ruling fetish, which enabled the imperial bourgeoisie to impose coercive regimes of unpaid work on both sides of the Atlantic. Thus, the centrality of accumulation by appropriation, the appropriation of unpaid work, and the centrality of socially necessary unpaid work as fundamental to the historical movements of relative surplus value over the past 5 centuries. This also illuminates the limits to that geohistorical dynamic today. Well, earlier I characterized historical materialism as a labor theory of life. A labor theory of life posits the irreducible, differentiated unity of human work with wider metabolisms, with geological formations, astronomical cycles, such as those associated with Milankovitch or with solar cycles. So all of this has to be brought into play. In other words, Marx and Engels' labor theory of life is not a constructivism, but a historical method through which to comprehend dialectical antagonisms like those in capitalist agriculture, and non-dialectical antagonisms like volcanic eruptions or solar minima, whose impacts are always mediated through specific class relations. Those class relations Marx and Engels underscored in the German ideology are always class relations in the web of life. From this standpoint, the labor process is not only a fundamental site of class struggle and of metabolic transformation, but of a greater totality through which the dynamics of specifically capitalist value and the ways in which capitalism's unity of the endless conquest of the earth and the endless accumulation of capital are brought together. This is not, in contrast to somebody like Matthew Huber, a labor process formalism. It doesn't reduce capitalism to the labor process, but says that the labor process and labor process change is the point of departure and return for any adequately geohistorical account of capitalism, its possibilities for renewal, and its geohistorical limits. So attempts to separate these two moments have undermined the eco-socialist imaginary and indeed much of so-called critical environmental studies. They have blinded us to the method that would allow us to identify capitalism's weakest links in the present climate conjuncture, which have to do with the relations between paid work, unpaid work, social reproduction, and the reproduction of planetary life. And this is intimately related to our broader vision of socialism and our reading of what is possible in the present conjuncture. So to begin to wrap this up here in the next minute or two, my argument has sprouted from a reading of the history of capitalism that draws directly on 3 of Marx and Engels' most fundamental claims. First, the labor process is, for communists, the ontological and methodological point of departure for understanding human relations, especially, but not only, the history of class society. Secondly, the labor process is a metabolic contradiction, at once expressing and mediating through dialectical inversions the concrete dynamics of class and their specific mediations in historical capitalism. And third, the modern proletariat can only exist world historically and through its doubly twofold relation of the production of life, both of one's own and labor, and a fresh life in procreation, as Marx and Engels write, which manifests on the one hand as natural, on the other as a social relation. And from this reading, we can extract three major implications. First, labor does not make man, nature does not make man, and man is not prior to labor. Rather, labor created man. This is a labor metabolic ontology. Second, the labor process joins the dialectical activation of the soil and the worker, as Marx writes, as a differentiated ontological and geohistorical unity, such that labor power is mobilized not only through the cash nexus, but also through regimes of socially necessary unpaid work. Finally, the origins of capitalism and its capitalogenic crisis tendencies in the web of life are therefore located, again following Marx, through modern proletarianization beginning in the long 16th century. The first and second implications form the core of this third, the Capitalocene thesis, as I've developed, and the core premise holds that the theoretical struggle, in Lenin's sense, can only be advanced on the terrain of praxis, which includes both contemporary struggles and the retrodictive enterprise of understanding the planetary proletariat's world historical existence. The communist horizon approaches world historically or not at all. And this begins to really illuminate and give us some tools to flesh out the connective tissues between the trinity that I often emphasize, between power, profit, and life, or another trinity between the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid, to begin to make sense of the underlying dynamics of how oppression, exploitation, always with and within the web of life, are unfolding, and therefore to identify the conditions of capitalist renewal, but also the conditions of capital's limit. And the most likely outcome of this crisis, we can begin to discern, or the possible trajectories coming out of this crisis. Finally, I want to say why this matters directly and palpably in terms of the actually existing class struggle. And here I will summarize a book's worth of writing into a paragraph. Here's the thing, that the history of climate is in the history of class society is what I call a history of the climate class conjuncture. Let me simply share the biggest takeaway. Civilizations emerge under specific and usually favorable climatic conditions. These are baked into the mode of production and its class structure. When those climate conditions shift, as in the Dark Ages cold period, or the Little Ice Age, or the long cold 17th century, crises ensue. For Western Rome and feudal Europe, the climate class conjuncture was an epochal crisis. It was a crisis of the mode of production. For capitalism in the long 17th century, it was a developmentalist crisis resolved through worldwide primitive accumulation. Unfavorable climate changes deriving from dialectical and non-dialectical forcing are bad for ruling classes. They are moments of political possibility for the direct producers and reproducers. Climate is for sure not everything, as I've argued many times, not in the past, not today, but we cannot meaningfully identify anything about the political possibilities of the present without a class historical reading of climate, power, and production. And finally, we should emphasize that capitalism is not reducible either to a social system or to an economic logic. It contains those moments. But these are expressions of capitalism as a way of organizing planetary life. This is the core of the proposition that capitalism is a world ecology, dialectically joining the endless accumulation of capital, the pathological pursuit of power, and the Promethean co-production of planetary life. World ecology takes seriously and seeks to open up the argument for a proletarian interscience, if you will, not as a cure-all to the epistemological problems of interdisciplinarity, we've had enough of that, but as the intellectual method that expresses the standpoint of the proletariat and its philosophy of praxis. I too may be a preacher to empty pews, but it's a risk worth the candle. From this guiding thread, as Marx might say, we can make sense of today's crisis not as anthropogenic, made by man, but as capitalogenic, made by capital. From this critique, we can begin to discern the webs of planetary life and potential solidarity between all the workers of the world, paid and unpaid, human and extra-human. Only then can we coalesce the intellectual resources of hope, as Raymond Williams might say, necessary to mount an internationalist challenge to the bourgeoisie's biospheric hegemony. Only then can we begin practically to move from the capitalist scene to the proletariat scene. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, for this wonderful and complex conference. But I think you show us so many ideas, and you made many relations that, including for me, that I am a little old. It's difficult to understand, but I have some questions, but I will wait if our colleagues in the audience want to ask something or have any doubt. If not, I have a question. You said, among many things, ideas and concepts, you said that as Marx had said, that labor created men. I would like to know first if you agree with this, and second, if we think that there is a web of life, as you said, as you propose, then the production of things, of goods, are not only products of men labor, because for Marx, only men works. Animals don't work. And I have a doubt. If animals work too, so we could say that they produce value. Because for Marx, of course, only human labor can produce value. No? So I'd like to listen you about this, that my doubt.
That's standard. So in the first moment, Marx clearly recognizes that other forms of life works, and he talks about this in some detail at various moments of Capital. What Marx is criticizing, not endorsing, is Capital's definition of work, which is an ideological move as well as an economic move. The definition of work in terms of valorized work, of wage labor. Marx is, of course, a critic of such wage labor formalism, identifying, even in the pages of Capital Volume 1, the French sharecropper, the proletarian fonde, as a proletarian, or a semi-proletarian, more precisely. So the dynamic of what I have summarized elsewhere as proletariat and biotariat and femitariat stresses, in fact, the dependence of the regime of socially necessary labor time on coercive political, cultural, legal regimes of unpaid work. So the dynamics of abstract social labor find as their pedestal the regimes of socially necessary unpaid work. That is perhaps one of the 3 or 4 major arguments in Capitalism and the Web of Life, which I've since tried to elaborate as best I can. So there is a dialectical tension between paid and unpaid work as shorthands, not as literal economic phenomena. And we can get into that more if you're curious. It's an excellent question. The phrase labor created man is, of course, from the Anti-Düring. It's from Engels. And in the famous essay, the role of labor played by labor in the transition from ape to man. Of course, Engels was incorrect factually, given the limits of knowledge of the time. Many of the things that he said, nevertheless, the central insight has been confirmed time and time again, that the evolution of pre-modern homonyms, especially around the use of fire, which impacts cooking, which impacts digestion, was a fundamental moment in the emergence of biologically modern humans. Now, of course, my point is much beyond that, that a Marxist ontology is a labor metabolic ontology, or it's nothing. It's really a form of bourgeois pluralism, which is fine. I'm simply articulating the position that Marx takes, that there is no separation of metabolism and labor in the dynamics that he is charting.
Thank you. Luciano.
Okay, yeah. Hi. Okay, yeah. It's more here. Okay, yeah. Okay. Hi, Professor Moore. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Luciano. I'm from Argentina. And my question is more about strategy or future strategies regarding the current climate crisis. I know there is a growing debate within the global left and the ecological activists regarding if we should support a Green New Deal strategy or a degrowth strategy to address the climate crisis. And I really want to know, what do you think about this? And the second question is are there any of these strategies possible within the current capitalist world system? Thank you.
Outstanding. Let me try to be brief. Small questions, right? So in my view, and again, I've written quite a lot about this in recent years, that capitalism has entered its zombie phase. It is dead. Its inner sources of dynamism and animation are gone, but it is still moving around, and it is still quite deadly. In my view, we are living through a transition to one or more post-capitalist orders, and it remains to be seen what that will look like. And we could talk more specifically, but I am certain I agree with Varoufakis in the broad spirit of the argument, as well as Samir Amin, that we are moving towards some mode of political accumulation, or what Amin would call a tributary formation. I think this is already implicit in the neoliberal imperial model of financialization and its mantra of too big to fail. Now, the other part of this question is really about eco-socialism, and all of these terms are slogans that mean many, many different things to many, many different people. So they're hard to nail down. There is an anti-imperialist tendency within degrowth associated with Jason Hickel. I think he and his comrades raise many crucial questions. There are elements of the position of a Green New Deal, or sometimes called a left eco-modernism, that is more problematic because it's blind to questions of imperialism by and large. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions. But the Green New Deal is, first of all, a deeply flawed historical metaphor, because I think they've not really plumbed the depths of the New Deal and how it was a containment strategy of militant labor, of the ruling class to discipline labor in the 1930s. It's a terrible metaphor, but it's also deeply blind to the social democratic illusion. As we know, social democrats are structurally pro-imperialist, and the exceptions we can find historically can be counted on one hand. So at the center of this, in my view, if the question is ultimately about the forms of political struggle that are necessary, I think it has to take the form of an anti-imperialist internationalism, because as we've learned from the past century of counterinsurgency and the past 25 years of American regime change politics, remember, the past 25 years have seen 1/3 of the over 500 foreign military interventions carried out by the United States. Since 1999, over 1/3 of those have occurred. The level of American military power and deployment, along with regime change politics, is extraordinary. It outstrips even what we saw during the Cold War, because, of course, they were limited by the Soviet Union and China. So we have to have an anti-imperialist strategy at the core of any democratic politics of climate justice. And we also need to start crying bullshit around the appropriation of climate justice as if it can be done in some on-the-cheap bargain basement way. We got hands up. We have virtual hands. Maybe on the ground as well.
He not hear you. Professor Jason, in the chat, Giacomo has a question for you.
Okay, so Professor Moore, do you see the possibility of filling these pews with the cosmovision of indigenous peoples? I think, and I've written about this. Is that the question? Yes?
Yeah, that's all.
That is the question?
Yes.
There is, and I've written about this as well. There's no question that cosmovisions of indigenous peoples are relevant, useful, generative. Let's also highlight a widespread tendency across the Americas, but also across the world, towards new forms of bourgeois nationalism that are often covered up in social justice language. So I would say that I'm deeply unsettled by tendencies, for instance, to invoke defense of life territories. However defense-oriented they might be, we do not need a Heideggerian dwelling strategy for the movements of the world. We need to have an assessment of how different peoples are integrated in class-structured ways. And the idea that indigenous peoples are somehow outside of class society is not only false, but profoundly misleading to the kinds of internationalist politics and class politics within social formations that we need. Now, of course, my views are affected by the kind of political discourse now in vogue amongst rad lib professors in the United States, which love indigenous peoples as long as they don't have political power and hate them once they gain political power, as with Evo Morales and Mas in Bolivia.
Jason, now David wants to make a comment or a question. Please, David.
Hi, David. I'm a big fan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to apologize to everyone for missing my presentation, first of all. Look, I didn't see the reminder, but here is my question to your very thought-provoking presentation, Jason. It was a tremendous provocation to, I think, to everyone. My question is really on what is the relation of class struggle to the valorization of labor power. this is a theme that I don't think has been addressed sufficiently. And of course, in a narrow sense, I see it, traditionally focusing on the wage of the worker. But is it not now in this world have new dimensions? The social wage, even the reproducing labor power is contingent on the climate and on the issue of climate change. So I wanted to pose that question to you. And I also have, well, I'll be quiet about something else because other people are waiting. Thank you.
Well, David, is this a question about proletarianization? I want to make sure that I'm hearing.
It's a question relating to the new dimensions of class struggle, relating to valorization of labor power that is pushing the limits of what capitalism can deliver, and then moving to new horizon, to an eco-socialist horizon, because those limits will not be exceeded under capital reproduction. That's really my question.
Well, you stated the matter perfectly, and I would simply invoke Marx on the working day as my comradely and complementary contribution to your, I think, essentially correct statement, as I understand it, that capitalism, of course, lays waste to labor power, but then also must deal with the reproduction of labor power, a recurrent problem across the long arc of capitalism. What Marx points out in the Working Day chapter is that, and I'm being crude, of course, it all comes down to the frontier. Well, they can destroy the English working class because there's still a physically uncorrupted Irish working class. And those days where there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of new workers who can be flushed into the system are now over. There are, of course, other contradictions that have to do with surplus capital, the agricultural productivity crisis linked to the climate crisis. There are many other dynamics, but essentially the frontiers that have underwritten capital's ability and empire's ability to restructure capitalism out of crisis no longer exist. And it's not just a limits to growth frontier, and that's a flawed conception, but it's also a waste frontier, and this is the climate crisis, but it's also the plastics crisis. It is the endocrine and health system crisis. That's the cancer crisis. There are all these dynamics where the reproduction of labor power in the imperialist countries has just cratered. And there are social reasons for it, as I've written about, but there are also biological reasons and web of life reasons for it, and they're all coming together. So it's going to lead to a new worldwide class politics. Well, your guess is as good as mine in terms of where that leads. Who's up next?
Please, William.
Bill, are you there?
So, William, please.
Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Great question.
Well, that's just a fabulous talk that you've given, Jason. I really appreciate all of the many insights. I'm sort of wondering about the question of the relationship between our species and non-human nature. And you mentioned that Marx's own analysis, recognizes both nature and labor as sources of wealth and so on. We can talk about how capital is valorized through labor. But I guess the point I would make is, what is this relationship between the two, in the sense that I guess my own sense of it is the dialectical relationship is a part-whole relationship. And the problem with the kind of Cartesian nature culture binary is that it misconceptualizes a relationship as relationship between two separate entities somehow, where in fact, as you say, from the beginning, labor creates humanity, Engels' point, and thus humanity emerges within nature and never escapes nature. We are simply part of nature. Marx recognizes this in the 1844 manuscripts, and I think it's consistent through his entire writing, actually. So if we think of the relationship as a dialectical part-whole relationship, I think we can begin to recognize how, there are certain emergent characteristics of humanity that enable us to labor through consciousness, through collaboration, through the mediation of symbols and language and so on and so forth. All of that is integral to who we are and to our own natural being, since we are natural beings. We're not escaping anything natural when we're thinking, for example. Thought is simply part of nature. So I guess what I'm getting at is, it seems to me that in some respects, you're sort of, some of your formulations seem to be collapsing the distinction, which is, I think, what a lot of new materialism does. And your work is very popular among some new materialists, which I think is great because—
No, that's not true. No, the new material, I mean, maybe you're reading somebody that I'm not, but no, there's no love lost between the new materialists and I.
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. I have a good colleague who, when he teaches new materialism, he includes your work as an exemplar. So at least among some consumers, let's say, maybe not the major new materialist writers, they might see you as a kind of— they probably do see you as a real disturbing force. But I think in a certain sense, a lot of people attracted to new materialism are attracted to your work, which is probably a good thing, because then they can really get a whole really deep analysis of Marxism, even though maybe it wasn't what they were exactly looking for. Anyway, that wasn't my main question, but I wonder if you could address this question of the relationship between our species and the rest of nature.
Well, it has to be historical. It has to be geohistorical. So we can't, so if it's a part whole, what's the part and what's the whole in a particular historical movement? So this may be, fairly abstract for many people, but dialectical processes as opposed to interactional processes, dialectical processes are characterized by asymmetries and by then the historical unraveling and transcendence of that original asymmetry. So I know you know this, Bill, but just to explicate it, bourgeois and proletarian begins at one point and then leads to not only to labor's triumph over the bourgeoisie, the expropriators are expropriated, but to the abolition of that, to the radical revolutionary transformation of that original dialectical moment. And so I think often nature and society are referred to as a dialectic. I think that's false, in large part because that's the vocabulary of imperialism. You blur in your question, and it sounds like I'm nitpicking, so I don't really mean to appear that way. There's a species question and there's a humanity question. Humanity is an invention of imperialism, actually in the 16th and 17th centuries. And you can see it very clearly emerge with Locke and the Civilizing Project, but even earlier with the Iberian scholastics and their metaphysical instrumentalism, culminating in the famous Valladolid controversy. In any event, I think that the way that I would approach your question is that we need to move, as Marx would move, to a specific level of determination in order to begin to look at these processes in a historically specific way. So just like, I think your question, if I'm hearing, is for me, is pitched too much at the level of work in general. So humans need to work in order to reproduce and live from day to day and to reproduce the species and all of those. It's a socio-ecological dynamic. Or there's production in general, but production in general doesn't tell us anything. We need to look at, for instance, the specific antagonisms of large-scale industry. And so for me, those questions are geohistorical. And in order to address them, we also need to confront what I see as, frankly, a series of neoliberal apologists. This wasn't your point with the new materialists, But for some reason, people link me to the new materialists. So I just want to say, new materialists are kind of neoliberal monism. I'm apparently smeared as a monist. I'm not a monist. I'm not sure what I flatten distinctions around. Indeed, the whole sort of contours of the specific arguments again and again are about the distinctive character of human labor in the web of life and against the flattening of humans and the rest of nature. But at a higher level of abstraction, Marx is very clear. Like in the Grundrisse, labor is a specifically harnessed natural force, like you're saying, Bill. So I think that we have to begin to pose this question that you posed to me at more specific levels of determination, as Marx would say. Otherwise, we can't get very far because we're back to the Feuerbach problem. We're back to man in general. And Marx and Engels spent their lives. You know this, but many people may not know this. Marx and Engels were emphatic critics of bourgeois humanism and this idea of man in general, and as well as nature in general. And they called it one-sided. They called it abstract. They criticized it again and again and again. And so I'm not a post-humanist. I am a Marxist humanist, which is also a Marxist naturalist.
Oh, thanks so much for that clarification. And I guess, it does remind me, it does take me back to theses on Feuerbach, and in particular, the one you quoted, right? That humans are the ensemble of social relations. There's no kind of general category of the human being. And I think the key thing there, for me, the way I read that is social relations are always socio-ecological relations.
Yes. And Marx says this directly.
Yeah.
Okay, Jason, I will raise a question for you. Not about exactly what you have said, but in general, the question is how to introduce in our researchers the question of the ecological crisis. I'm asking this because we have many students, graduate students, they from international relations, and we are listening these days, discussing about the ecological crisis. But when we go to our fields, we forget and we maintain aside the ecological question. So I would ask you in this way, is it possible, no matter what we are studying, to include the ecological dimension?
Well, everything. This is Marx's insight, that everything is irreducibly socio-ecological. So there is no such thing as an ecological crisis that is not also linked to the organization of labor. Here I pitch the argument at a very high level of abstraction. I think for me, what I recommend is a shift from the environment to environment making. There is, for ecologists, a wonderful phrase where they speak of ecosystem engineers. And humans are not the only ecosystem engineers, of course. We can think of ants, we can think of beavers, we can think of all forms of life. They are making their environments, not in a constructivist idealist sense, but in a Marxist sense. The great Marxist biologists, Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, are absolutely fundamental on this point, to emphasize that what Darwin saw in species evolution within specific ecological niches was one-sided, that the species were in fact creating environments and evolving simultaneously. And if we apply that insight to all manner of social phenomena, to imperialism and states, to financial markets, to industrialization, to vanguard parties to popular revolts, there is a dynamic of environment making. We are not simply in environments, we are making those. Those environments are not only material, as in the built environment of cities, but also ideological. One of the fundamental errors of modern environmentalism, and I think it was on purpose, I don't think it was an error, was to construct the idea that there was a domain of life that was separate from work. And this is, for environmentalism in the global north, a consistent through line all the way from the 1970s to the present of how environmentalists, mainstream environmentalists, not environmental justice movements, mainstream environmentalists, like the environmentalism of the rich implicated by Martinez Allier, that is profoundly anti-labor and was from the beginning. You can go all the way back to first wave environmentalism in the United States and see that genesis. Conservationism was tightly linked to eugenics, which was tightly linked to anti-working class and anti-immigrant politics. So when we talk about an ecological dimension, well, a dimension of what? And it goes back to Bill's question, is labor the dimension of ecology, or is ecology the dimension of labor? Well, I think we can't leave that to the philosophers. It's a philosophical question, but it's actually a question that we can approach in our concrete empirical research. And it has a real effect on the kinds of analyses that we develop if we take seriously the idea that environmental change and class formation and imperialism are all interpenetrating in the history of capitalism. We begin to see that history in a very new way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Moore. Thank you, William, for being with us until now. Thank you, Christopher. We are closing this, and our colleague here.
Thank you to everyone. This was an honor to be in conversation, and I want to send my solidarity to everyone online and my comrades in Brazil. I hope to meet you in person sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Global Disaster and World Society Conference. And thank you for everyone who contributed with us. Thank you for Fabio for being organizing finances, technology, and everything. E para todo o pessoal que ajudou aí, né? Muito obrigado. Vamos continuar. E agora o nosso trabalho é como é que nós colocamos essas ideias das nossas pesquisas. O que tem? Agradeço quem?
So to close this event, I would like to thank you, Christian Schutter from World Society Foundation. He provide all the financial resource for helping us to make this event possible. So Christian, I haven't seen you before, so nice to meet you, and thank you for everything.